In our last episode, we looked at the history of Motown Records, which was the vision of one man, Berry Gordy. But he had lots of help from very talented musicians, and he recorded most of them right there in Detroit in Hitsville, USA. Now, when we talked about the history, we talked about some of the artists, but we really didn't dig down deep into their music and their hits very much, and that's what we're going to do in this episode. We're going to take two groups from Motown, two very instrumental groups from Motown that helped define the success that Motown became. And now I know we can't hurry love, but we can talk about the Supremes and the Miracles. Let's drop the needle. Peter Moore, Ronnie White, and Bill Smokey Robinson had been singing together since they were 11 years old. They formed a group a little later and called it originally the Five Chimes. They then became the Miracles. That was Bobby Rogers, Marv Tarplin, Ronnie White, Claudette Robinson, Smokey Robinson, and Peter Moore. In 1958, Berry Gordy was impressed enough that he hired the Miracles. And he got a real deal here because Smokey Robinson not only was a gifted singer and the Miracles a great act, but Smokey could write and arrange songs too. He became a big hit maker for Motown. The Miracles actually became Motown's first successful selling act. In 1960, Bill Smokey Robinson teamed up with Berry Gordy to co-write a song, and it became Motown's first #1 pop song, and it was called Shop Around. The song details a mother giving her son advice about how to find a wife. You better shop around. The original recording that they did was very bluesy, and it was released only in Detroit. But Berry Gordy thought if they re-recorded it and made it more pop-sounding, it could become a bigger hit. So that's what they did, and it was. The Miracles were also the first Motown act to be schooled on choreography and stage presence. They were also the first Motown act to appear on American Bandstand in 1960. Their next hit came in 1962, and it's called You Really Got a Hold on Me. Now, Smokey said he was inspired by Sam Cooke, listening to that great recording of Cooke's, which is Bring It On Home to Me. The song made it into the top 10, and then a year later, in 1963, the Beatles included it on their second album, their version of it, called With the Beatles. The Miracles followed this up with another top 10 hit called Mickey's Monkey, and this is one of the rare times that Smokey didn't write the song. It was actually written by the team of Holland Dozier Holland, who were Motown's chief songwriters. But Smokey heard it and thought it would be a great fit for them, so he convinced the songwriters to let the Miracles record it. And it has a real party feel. It starts with Smokey going, "All right, is everybody ready?" To which the crowd responds enthusiastically, "Yes." And then Smokey goes, "All right, here we go. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4." And then they go straight into that unforgettable chorus. I'm sure you remember this. Lum-dee-lum-dee-lie. You can do the next line. The song was created to popularize a dance that had just come out, which was also called the Monkey. 1964 was another big year for the Miracles. First off, Smokey Robinson becomes a vice president of Motown Records. And in that same year, they appeared on the world-famous Tammy Show out in California at the Santa Monica Civic, where they were joined by fellow Motown artists, the Supremes, and then Chuck Berry, Leslie Gore, the Beach Boys, the Rolling Stones, and James Brown. 1965, they decided to have 3 hits: The Tracks of My Tears, My Girl Has Gone, and Goin' to a Go-Go. Then in 1967, Berry Gordy decides to change the name of the group to focus on Smokey Robinson being the lead singer. So now they're christened Smokey Robinson and the Miracles. And they have another hit, which sails to #4, which is called I Second That Emotion. But by 1969, there were big changes, not only in Motown, but in the music industry as a whole. And Smokey was getting a little fed up and decided that he was going to leave the Miracles and leave the business. But he didn't last very long. He came back and they recorded Tears of a Clown. big hit for them. Smokey stayed for another 2 years, and then in 1972, he left the band once again. Without Smokey, the Miracles continued to tour till the 1980s. And then in 1987, Smokey Robinson was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, but not the Miracles. And Smokey was pretty disappointed at this, and he spent a number of years really vocally lobbying that the Miracles should be in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So finally, in 2012, the Miracles were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So the Miracles and Smokey Robinson had an incredible run at the very early days of Motown Records. But they weren't the most successful act that came out of Motown. No, that would be the next group we're going to talk about, and that would be the Supremes. In 1954, 4 friends who all lived in public housing in Detroit decided to try singing together, and they formed a little group that they called the Primes. And this evolved into a group called the Supremes. After they were the Primes, they then called themselves the Primettes, and in 1960, they really wanted a recording contract. And so Diane Ross, yeah, that was her name at that time, Diane Ross, went to her neighbor, who was this guy called Smokey Robinson, and asked if he could help her get a recording contract at Motown. So Smokey said, sure, let's give it a try. And he arranged an audition for them with Berry Gordy. But the audition did not go well. Berry Gordy was not really impressed. And he said to them, girls, come back after you graduate high school. We'll talk then. But the girls didn't give up. They just kind of started hanging around Hitsville, USA. And in fact did background vocals for Marvin Gaye and Mary Wells. Finally, in 1961, Berry Gordy does give them a recording contract. But by this point, they are a trio. Betty McClown had left, and so we were left with Ross, Ballard, and Wilson. When Gordy gave them a recording contract, he said they needed to change their name. So first he suggested the Darlenes. They didn't like that. Then how about the Sweet Peas? They didn't like that either. Then Berry suggested the Royal Tones. They didn't like that either. And then finally they countered with the Supremes. By this time, Diane Ross had decided to change her name to Diana, and Gordy chose her to be the lead singer of the group. They recorded a bunch of songs which went nowhere, and in fact they were kind of mocked around Hitsville, USA as the Motown act with no hits. But that all changed in the spring of 1964, when the songwriting team of Holland Dozier Holland had written a song that they liked, and they gave it to the Marvelettes to record, but the Marvelettes hated it. So they decided they wouldn't record it. So then the songwriters gave it to the Supremes, who also disliked the song, but they were convinced to record it. And it went on to be #1 in the US and #3 in the UK. And of course, it is Where Did Our Love Go? This first song was followed by 4 consecutive #1 hits in the US. Baby Love, which was also #1 in the UK, Come See About Me, Stop in the Name of Love, and Back in My Arms Again. The Supremes appeared on stage in high-fashion gowns and wigs and tight choreography. By 1965, they were touring the world as international stars. But then, as we've talked about before, in the 1967s and 68s, things were changing in Motown, and Berry Gordy decided to change the name of the group from the Supremes to Diana Ross and the Supremes. Well, this didn't set too well with some of the other members of the group. Florence Ballard drank excessively and started missing recording dates and shows. So finally, she was replaced by Cindy Birdsong. But Cindy didn't last that long because she was contracted with another group. So Ballard returned. But behind the scenes, Gordy was secretly working to get Cindy out of her contractual agreement so that she could join the Supremes. And then this drama all came to a head in Las Vegas on July 1st of 1967, when Florence Ballard was in her dressing room where all the gowns were for the performances and discovered there was a spare set of costumes there for Cindy Birdsong. Well, she performed that night, Florence did, but she was really quite drunk. And when Berry saw her on stage, he fired her and brought Cindy in to replace her. Ballard was paid almost $140,000 in royalties and earnings. She tried a solo career, but that failed. Then she tried to sue Berry Gordy and the Supremes, and that failed. And then in 1976, at the age of 32, Florence Ballard died in poverty. But things were changing, and sales were dropping off. And so in 1970 in Las Vegas, Diana Ross and the Supremes gave their final performance together. Diana Ross, of course, went on to a successful solo career and also a career in acting. Without Ross, the new Supremes were Mary Wilson, Cindy Birdsong, and Jean Terrell. They continued on over the years, but then that iteration of the Supremes finally did their final concert in London in 1977. Supremes were the most commercially successful of all Motown acts, and they scored 12 #1 singles. Where Did Our Love Go?, Baby Love, Come See About Me, Stop in the Name of Love, Back in My Arms Again. All of those were in 1964. Then I Hear a Symphony in 1965, You Can't Hurry Love, You Keep Me Hanging On, and Love Is Here and Now You're Gone in 1966. In 1967, they had The Happening. In 68, they had a hit with Love Child. And in 69, they had a hit with Someday We'll Be Together. Now, as usual, I've created a Spotify playlist where you can listen to some of the songs that I've talked about in this episode. And here's the link, and I'll also put it in the comments below. The Miracles and the Supremes, no doubt, were the biggest hits for Motown. Turned out a lot of incredible music. And Berry Gordy has actually said that without the Miracles, there would have never been a Motown Records. So as we listen back to the music of both the Miracles and the Supremes, we just got to say, thank you, Smokey Robinson and the Miracles, and thank you, Diana Ross and the Supremes, for lots of great music. And thank you all for watching, too. In a future episode, we'll look at a couple of more Motown acts. And until then, keep it rockin'.
If you liked this episode, hit the like button, and you can also leave me a comment down below, and I'll respond to you. If you subscribe, we'll let you know when future episodes come out.